Given that Netflix is the source of a decent amount of the problems called out by this very documentary, the fact that they're the ones behind it is kind of infuriating. Outstanding. This is a documentary discussing queer stand up comedy and talks with many queer stand up comics, many of which I hadn't heard, which I half expected. I haven't really kept up with the stand up comedy world for the last uh, decade or two uh, at this point. But that having been said, it wasn't just like the newer faces that I didn't recognize. This, for being something that by its nature has to kind of condense a lot of stuff, like it has to cover a fair amount of history and a lot of people, some of which are touched on briefly, many of which do get interviewed and get to speak their own story and their own truth. And that helps a lot in something like this where you're not really going to get a deep dive into every single one of them. Some of them you spend more time with than others, but it feels like for the kind of overview style documentary that this is going for, it does feel like an appropriate amount of time is spent on each one. With the ones who get a little bit more time, that feels earned. So I feel like this is very well assembled to give people a sense of the value of queer stand up, the evolution of queer stand up, talking about how, gay comedy was a thing, but for a very long time, you had to be the punchline. And there was a difference between gay comedy and gay stand up. Some of them talk about how a lot of the early sort of inspirations for some of the older comics were people like Paul Lynde, Rip Taylor, Charles Nelson Riley, people who were on variety shows and game shows where you could be that kind of flamboyant gay figure. But actual getting on a mic and doing stand-up comedy was something that kind of evolved a bit more later. And it covers a lot of the pioneers on that, including some I'd never heard of. There's a fair amount of time devoted to a stand-up comic named Robin Tyler, who I had never heard of, is an amazing figure, has lived an amazing life, and is damn funny. Like, she's fantastic. And I was kind of embarrassed to have never heard of her. And even some of the folks that, like, they mentioned who, aren't with us anymore and couldn't be interviewed, there were a fair number that I'd never heard of. I'm like, I gotta look into these people. Like, Moms Mabley was on, like, I need to find out more about her, because holy cow. So even for me, who had, for obvious reasons, has a foothold in queer culture, and while, as I said, I haven't kept up with the stand-up comedy scene, I haven't been completely departed from it, and I used to be more into that whole sort of area. I don't know what else to call it. Scene. So even for me, there was a lot here that either felt really good to hear said by the people, who were going to make these points and had lived these lives, or just point out some things that I hadn't known. And like, there's a lot of interesting moments touched on, both good and bad. There was kind of an upsurge of like gay understanding and gay prominence in pop culture building up through the 70s, and then AIDS hit. And that robbed us not only of so many literal lives, but it kind of halted a lot of progress in artistic areas, including stand-up. And that gets appropriately called out. And as I kind of alluded to before, very specifically, Netflix gets called out for its platforming of people like Dave Chappelle. It's pointed out, unfortunately, I can't remember everybody's name, so I forget precisely who it was who said this, but one of them pointed out that the things said as jokes by transphobic comedians are frequently factually incorrect. The way that they describe transgender or gender at all is factually wrong. They describe it as some sort of delusion or mental illness. The WHO doesn't even consider it that anymore, and hasn't for a number of years now. So this stuff is factually incorrect, and it should be a responsibility for platform holders to not platform someone who is peddling proven lies, harmful lies at that. And no, this is not a praise of Netflix, because Netflix is a business. And as I am frequent to say, corporations are amoral entities, not immoral. If you're immoral, you go out of your way to violate morality. If you are amoral, you don't take morality into consideration at all. So Netflix is an amoral entity that is happy to profit from both sides. It is happy to platform a transphobe at the same time that it funds and backs and puts out a documentary where part of it, not even a massive part, but part of it very pointedly criticizes what Netflix itself is freaking doing. And, part of the problem is Netflix is at this point the high benchmark for stand-up comedy. For a long time, when I was more into stand-up, it was Comedy Central. Getting a Comedy Central special was like the goal for most stand-up comics. And like what they might want after that would vary. Some might want to springboard that into a TV career or a movie career or whatever. But as a stand-up career, that was kind of the high watermark most could reasonably aim for. I suppose like the real high benchmark would be something like an HBO special, the kind of thing George Carlin used to do. But I think realistically for a long time, the attainable benchmark for like, you've definitely made it, you're a deal in this industry, was a Comedy Central special. But like that's not anymore. It's now Netflix. And that's the unfortunate reality. But again, I don't want to dwell too much on that, because the variety and the intersectionality, not only of people, but the addressing of intersectionality. The fact that, for someone like Wanda Sykes, she's going to have a different experience coming out from Margaret Cho, from Lily Tomlin. It impacts your experience if you are a woman, if you're a man, if you are white, if you are trans, if you are Asian, if you are black, whatever it might be, is going to have some impact on the specifics of how it is for you. And there's also a decent addressing of, like, again, the overall timeline and how things have changed. In talking about the people who broke a lot of ground at a certain point in time, it's also an acknowledgement that, like, yeah, we have come further than that. Watching a clip of Rosie O'Donnell when she had her talk show and she wasn't out publicly, and she had Ellen DeGeneres on, who is not interviewed in the thing, which I'm kind of grateful for. She's become an odd figure, but she is absolutely historically significant, especially in terms of visibility on network television for queerness. But Rosie had Ellen on, and they had this clip, and Ellen had this whole bit that she said, yes, my character on the show is going to come out as Lebanese. And Rosie O'Donnell, and she talks about this, kind of like having this little solidarity moment, and jokingly on the show was like, sometimes I wonder if I might be Lebanese. And she talks about how, while she wasn't ready to fully come out publicly because of the potential hit to her career, she did want to in some way offer solidarity and, just be sure to stand beside Ellen, knowing what Ellen was doing. And there's a great sense of community among these people. You hear them praise each other, and there's a real sense of joy, even as there is an acknowledgement that, like, it's not the same for everybody, especially kind of with a focus on trans and gender queer comedians on the very back end, with a pretty heavy emphasis on Susie Izzard. She does get referred to as Eddie, because I don't think she had started using Susie regularly at the time this was recorded, which was 2022. The bulk of it was recorded. But in any case, like, she's great. She does get called she when referred to by other people. So that works. That works. And I'm pretty sure professionally she still largely goes by Eddie. Like, and I get that. Like, if you have an establishment under a certain thing, it's hard to change that for professional reasons. But, there's so many people who I recognize and admire, whether it was Wanda Sykes or Susie Izzard or Margaret Cho or Judy Gold. And, like, I couldn't even begin to list everybody who's in this. And it's a really well put together, again, in some ways, because of how much time and scope it's trying to cover, in some ways kind of surface, but it does a very good job of indicating where greater depth lies. So this isn't trying to put itself forward as like, here's the definitive story of queer stand-up. It is saying like, here's an overview. We could drill down into any one of these topics, any one of these specifics, or any one of these people, and have that be its own hour-and-a-half documentary. You get that sense, and that's a good sense to get from this kind of thing. And while it is largely talking about comedy, we get so many clips, so many people who are just really funny. And so it never forgets to include the jokes. It never forgets to remind us that this is ultimately why they do this, is to make people laugh. Whether it is to try and get, mainstream audiences to laugh, so maybe they might be more accepting of queer people, or whether it's to make their own community laugh so that they can feel a sense of joy even in hard times. Whatever it may be, it doesn't forget that laughter is kind of the point. And it's really well put together. I'm not going to call it like an all-time great, but definitely as a starting point for looking into queer stand-up comedy, this is a fantastic place to start. You're gonna come away with such a lengthy list of people to look into further. This is lovely for that. Like, I know we all appreciate like really thorough deep dives. I do too. But it is good to have a good, strong foundational 101 topic, kind of thing. And like, as I said, this had a bunch of stuff and people who I didn't know about. So that to me says, while it's not the deepest thing in the world, it's a really good foundational start to go and look more into these things. And yeah, I really liked it. Outstanding. Bite me, Netflix, but this is still good. And if you have a Netflix account, I would encourage you to check this out. So has anybody who is watching me seen this? What did you think about it? If you haven't seen it, do you have a favorite queer stand-up comedian? Susie Izzard, I think, has to be mine, but like there's a lot. There's a lot of really good ones, and so many of them are either interviewed or at least touched upon in this. Like, throw them out there. Give me what you got. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living, even if you can't help me out that way. Like, share, subscribe. All that helps me out. Don't worry too much about it, though. We take a relaxed attitude around here, so you can just come on back next time you need a break. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Goddess Elida, Zubin Lotfula, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Alistair McPherson, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, White Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Pal Barabajoggle, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. If you'd like me to... I read the names fine, then screwed it up. If you would like to hear me try and say your name while these guys chitter in my ears, check out the rewards on my Patreon. Yeah, you're not distracting at all.